Hey everyone, before we dive in, just a quick note. The views and opinions shared by our guests on Reset Critical are their own and don't necessarily reflect those of the institutions they represent, the host, producers, or any of our partners or sponsors. Some episodes touch on sensitive topics, so listener discretion is advised. Hi, everybody. This is Reset Critical, and I'm your host, Niaz Kasravi. We are here to bring some sanity and level set our public conversations around some of the most important issues which have gone totally off the rail. And so today we're going to be digging into the issue of criminal justice and racial justice. And as some of you might know, I am a trained criminologist and have been doing work on research and advocacy around criminal justice issues. When I started down this path, when I was a grad student, when I was studying it, when I got into the workforce, it was a topic that nobody really knew much about. My family, my community, the general public, they weren't exactly sure, what does Niaz do? And then over time, for a multitude of reasons, the issue of reforming the criminal justice system particularly became almost dinner table conversation. And we have made some progress and some strides over the last, I would say, decade or two. But recently, as the years have gone by, particularly in recent years, and especially over the last year, we have seen a lot of the progress we made being rolled back, a lot of backlash just towards the progress that we made and the things that we still want to do and that are needed for this country. Here with me to dig into some of those issues and related issues is Patrice Sulton. Patrice is a criminal defense and civil rights lawyer, the founder of DC Justice Lab, which is a nonprofit organization that works to reimagine public safety through research, legislative advocacy, and legal training. She's also the new executive director of the Center on Race, Inequality, and the Law at NYU School of Law. And I am super excited that you were on the West Coast and you agreed to be on the show with me, because this is a topic that's very near and dear to both of our hearts, I believe, and I couldn't think of anybody else that I wanted to have this conversation with. So welcome. We can just dive in. I'm going to start by asking you to tell us a little bit about DC Justice Lab. What prompted you to start it? What was the goal? And what did you accomplish while you were there? I know the organization is still up and running and thriving, but just give us a little history and the accomplishments of DC Justice Lab while you were there.
Thank you. That moment in time that you just described where this thing that we care so deeply about became dinner conversation for so many people, and not just in the US, but globally, people were looking at what is America doing with respect to who we punish, why we punish, how we punish, was really the motivation to start something new. I get excited about those moments in life that something really impossibly different feels suddenly possible or just out of reach if we stretch a little further or jump a little higher. And 2020 was that moment for me where people were really critically looking at our criminal legal system here. And we set out to make DC an example for the rest of the country on what smarter safety solutions could really mean and how we could approach criminal justice from a lens of racial justice and fairness and actual safety instead of optics.
What were some of the achievements that you're proud of that happened while you were at DC Justice Lab?
I am really proud of a lot of the law change that occurred, including some of the measures that weren't able to take root because Congress interfered with DC's ability to make those changes in law real, but it still reset the landscape and changed the conversation and helped people understand what's right and what's not right. And we really looked at the entire criminal legal system as a whole. So when we rethink the authority that police, prosecutors, and prisons have to inflict harm on community, and whether that's being used in a way that keeps people safer or makes people less safe, we can start to examine where we can go above the constitutional floor in designing a system. So in the policing context, that included changes to when police can chase someone in a vehicle throughout the city, which has led to the deaths of people in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere. When we look at our jails and prisons, it included everything from the food that leads to lifelong health consequences for people who have been incarcerated for even a short period of time, to the widespread practice of solitary confinement, to what happens when people come home and need to be able to lead the lives that they were told they should be leading before all of this happened. And in the prosecution context, it included anything from decriminalizing conduct that shouldn't have been criminalized in the first place, like street vending, to changing the gradations of specific offenses and really getting into the weeds of how we define crimes and penalties in the district.
I think what strikes me as important, and I feel like a broken record because I've been saying this for over 2 decades now, is that oftentimes when you talk about reforming the criminal justice system, what you are stamped with is you are soft on crime, you just want to let people do what they will without any consequence, and that's making our communities less safe. But that's not what we're talking about. I think one of the first things when I started to do this work that I found myself having to repeat over and over again is that everybody makes mistakes, right? Everybody breaks laws in one way or another, whether it's low level or extreme violations, and some people get caught and some people don't. At the end of the day, you have to think about what is the purpose of our criminal legal and criminal justice system. Is it just for punishment? Is it just so we can throw people away and lock people away and throw away the key? Or do we want it to serve a purpose? And I think it behooves us not to think about the fact that majority of people who go into the system come back into our communities. And the question is, what types of people do we want to come back into our communities? People who went in there with challenges that were not addressed and somehow became worse? Or do we want to help people? There's a consequence for breaking laws, but we want to help them to get to a better place so they can become productive members of society. And I think that is the bottom line of any advocate or activist calling for reforming and transforming the criminal justice system. It's not all these other stickers that people want to put on us. And it's not new. Although we are seeing it in a more kind of outrageous way under DJT 2.0, as I like to call it. But before we get to what's been happening under this new administration, so what you're saying is we did make a lot of strides in DC particularly, but also like federally across and nationally across the country in correcting for some of those ways that the system was broken, whether it was policing, whether it was reentry, whether it was prison conditions, prosecution, and things like that. And those are changes that you saw happen for the better in DC.
Yes. I love that you are constantly in defense of reason and common sense, because we generally understand the concept of overpunishment in so many other contexts.
Yep.
Most of us have either had a parent or been a parent or had a teacher or been a teacher. And we know that there's such a thing as going too far, where the punishment is actually making the behavior worse and not better. And for some reason, when we look at our criminal legal system and we isolate each individual case one by one, we can become so overwhelmed by wanting to respond to the harm that happened that we throw that common sense out the window. And it's hard to bring people back sometimes to understand that there is such a thing as inflicting too much state violence, just as there is such a thing as overpunishment in any other context. And so the strides that were made over the last couple of decades to really scrutinize where the lines are being drawn there and how much punishment is too much punishment become blurred the more the conversation becomes infected with bias and racism, because we forget about the humanity and those other contexts and applications that the same ideas have elsewhere in our lives when we otherize the people who are being affected by that change.
And I think that's exactly one of the main reasons that people can get on board with the tough on crime, the needless tough on crime, and the completely ineffective and shooting ourselves in the foot tough on crime, which we'll talk about, we're going down that path again, is that people have been dehumanized. People who are most impacted by these policies. So you may not, well, hopefully most parents will have a bit of empathy and sympathy for a child that they're trying to raise and discipline. And they think about what is the appropriate type of punishment and how long and how severe. But when we are over and over again completely exposed to these images and these talking points of how migrants and immigrants are this and they're violent criminals, and how Black people are this, and how it just allows you to see them as the other. And so it becomes easier to say, I don't care about this person, whether you consciously say it or subconsciously, to be okay with that happening to other people.
Yes. And some of what you said reminds me of how much narrative and culture really shape that battle. When we hear, for example, phrases like tough on crime, we usually think about policies that actually aren't tough on crime. They're actually not reducing crime. We have generations of evidence now that they worsen crime, and they're tough on people and they're tough on communities, and they might look tough and feel tough, but it's not the right label. And someone's pushed that narrative to make us think that's what tough on crime means. That's what rule of law means or law and order means, when we know those things empirically are not actually true. And even in the immigration example, a lot of times when we're talking about immigration or we're talking about immigrants, we're not talking about all immigrants. We're talking about non-white immigrants only. And to be able to use the language that's more precise in a way that people can still follow and share at the speed that information is followed and shared nowadays is really hard. I think that's part of the work we have cut out for us too, is how do we get people talking about these things in a way that's factually correct instead of using like the popular language and the language that appears in a lot of our laws, quite frankly.
That makes me think of, how do we combat this misinformation and this just outright lying and also just hiding of data? They're pulling down important data that actually has been collected by the FBI itself, for example, on violent extremism and whatnot. It makes me nervous as to how do we then, without these tools that are being blurred or taken down, how do we fight against this misinformation and actually bring people to a place of understanding? Where, like, is that just like going back to the library and pulling that data again? Is it focusing on the younger generation who is very open and much more idealistic, maybe? We've all been like students, and a lot of us have been college students, and we've been very hopeful, regardless of whatever craziness is happening, that we can make a difference. Like, how do we combat this? Because I feel like it's also this, like, the disappearing of information, the misrepresenting of information, but also with AI, like just false things being created, not just numbers and memes, images that just burn into your eyes and your head that it's hard to get rid of, no matter how false they are. I think it produces a fear in you. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I do. I think that myth busting is a really important and powerful tactic to be focused on right now. And one challenge is that when you want to get the information right, when you care about the truth, you want it to feel well supported by data and reliable sources. And it's hard to make yourself a reliable source without spending the time to make sure that everything is backed up and supported. But there are a lot of things that we know to be true from our own firsthand experience and observations and the course of history and what's working in other jurisdictions. And we really should be leaning into, I think, a lot of what we already understand. We've been here before to some degree, and there are some things we just know to be right and some things that we just know to be true that we have to get more comfortable saying loudly without needing 3 or 4 citations. And that can be really hard for people who care about the integrity of information and for people who have had their credibility questioned more than others.
Yeah, it certainly requires us to be a bit more brave and bold in the face of this oncoming vilifying of people who have any sort of ideas that's on the left of the political spectrum these days. I'm going to get back to the discussion around criminal justice reform. What has happened to the strides that were made in DC, and we'll get to the national stuff too, under the Donald Trump, his second administration? It's been crazy watching. We saw it happen in LA a little bit with a National Guard, but I know that in DC it was as much as it was an attack on immigrants and immigration, it was an attack on really criminal justice reform and the strides that have been made. So
what's happened in DC is exactly what Black Washingtonians have been warning could happen in DC for many years. Without statehood and full representation and an actual voice in the matters that affect them most, we were always vulnerable to this kind of violence and interference with governing our own affairs.
Tell us about that for people who might not know how DC works.
Yeah, DC is not a state, and the legislative history of the suffrage movement in DC is very much a history of racism. Dating back to the 19th century, we've seen people in Congress say time and time again that DC's ungovernable because of its population makeup and it having been a majority and plurality Black city for so long. And the same...
People say this with a straight face.
Yes, they say this under oath. They say this from the dais. If we look back then, we heard senators talking about people of color in the district as rats, like really dehumanizing language. But fast forwarding to the last few administrations, we hear them calling our schools inmate factories. We hear them dehumanizing our leadership of our city, lawmakers and executives because they're Black. And that sort of once quieter narrative is loud again, but it's always been racially motivated that we can't enjoy the same kind of power that someone might enjoy if you had a federal district that was majority white. And that has meant anything from not being able to implement the laws that have been passed there to not being able to spend the money that people who live there made and contributed on the things that would help them most. And the attacks we've seen on DC legislation over the last 30 years have almost always been pieces of legislation that directly affect the health and welfare of Black people who live there, whether it's abortion care, needle exchange access at the height of HIV spreading throughout our city faster than it was in a lot of other places, or our revised criminal code effort. It's always something that really affects the group of people who have the smallest voices and can be used as a political football for people running for office in other parts of the country who have an outsized say in how we live.
In DC, although you're in New York right now, but in DC, I'm sure your heart will always be partly in DC, people don't really have a right to a governing body the way we do elsewhere, which is why the federal government can step in and prevent you from doing the things that the residents of DC deem appropriate.
That's true. And it also means that there are fewer off-ramps from our criminal legal system in DC because some components of our criminal legal system are federal. And so there isn't anything that we can really do as residents to control how things are regulated or move. For example, we have no prison in Washington, D.C. Folks are sent to the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons and sent thousands of miles from home. And oftentimes that means that there's no real ability for our local legislature to have a say in how people are treated for the years that they live there or how their loved ones are able to help them while they're away or as they're coming home. It also means we don't have a governor who can pardon people in the way that states traditionally are able to pardon people. So even those back end solutions or off ramps or ways to stem the tide of mass incarceration, a lot of those tools are missing for people in Washington, D.C.
So in the last, 10 months, what has been rolled back in terms of the strides that were made when you were at DC Justice Lab?
If I can take the timeline back even farther to 2023.
Please do.
It was actually under the last administration that we saw congressional interference at a level we hadn't seen since the early 90s, around the time of that crime bill that I'm sure we'll have a chance to talk about today. And that was interference with DC having written its criminal code in a new way to modernize it and make it make sense. And I had the honor of working on that project before I started at DC Justice Lab, and the heartbreak that came with watching that be undone at the federal level.
Under the Biden administration.
Correct. This was in 2023. And I think it was emblematic of what we're seeing happen at a rapid pace over the last 10 months, which is folks who do know better are capitulating and falling down before they even get pushed, in the hopes that they will be able to retain enough power to do the good work that they believe needs to be done. And then the losses come anyway. And that's really been the hardest part for me, is watching the failure to defend what we know is going to be what we need, and then the failure to obtain the power that was the reason for capitulating in the first place. So it's been a very difficult time for Washingtonians who really invested a lot into trying to improve their own lives and be a model for states that need these solutions just as badly.
So it's like almost a power grab, this crime, tough on crime thing. It has zero to do with what's working, correct?
I agree.
Because what you see over and over again in many spaces, I believe, but especially in the legal and criminal justice system, is because it's so easy to get people to be afraid of crime. And that's valid. Everybody wants to have safety for their family and their kids, and they want to be able to go out in the city without being worried. I think politicians from across the aisle rely on being able to make people afraid to this valid fear that as humans we all have, so that they can then retain power. And I think perhaps some of them may actually not care, or just this is their agenda, they have ambition, but some of them might believe that I'm doing this, it's a price I'm willing to pay so I can stay in office and do all these other good things.
I think that's right. I think there are at least three kinds of fear at play there. There's a fear of actual crime and violence increasing if there's no understanding really of what the impact of a given law change will have. There's also a fear of looking weak on crime or looking uncaring, especially after something really harmful has happened. It's very easy to say, I care about this thing, and the way I'm going to show I care about it is through a maximum period of imprisonment for anybody who even thinks about doing it or is associated with anyone who does it, and really broadening the scope of our laws. And I think the third kind of fear is the fear of losing the ground that has been gained. And that's something I've come to appreciate more and more as time goes on, that there's a real fear of retrenchment and regression that leads people to go along to get along or hold the line instead of really pushing for what we know will work.
But tell me about that. What do you mean you have developed an appreciation for it? Does that mean you understand it better, or do you believe that sometimes that strategy is required?
It means I understand it better. I have always been aware that folks who pushed for a lot of the laws that led to this enormous boom in our prison population over the last 40 years, we're not all ill-intentioned. We're not all racist. We're not all aiming to put us in more danger, as mass incarceration to some degree has. And so really trying to examine what those underlying good intentions were so that we don't repeat the same thing now that we find ourselves in a very similar moment in history has been an important part of how I think about these things. And I look at what Black criminologists in particular wrote around those times and can really appreciate that part of what's at play is that there had been this civil rights movement that brought folks to positions that they didn't occupy before. And the fear of losing that ground, not just of protecting a particular middle class, but really the underlying statutes and those protective measures that were in place was not without basis. And we see now not just the repeal of a lot of the good work that was done 60 years ago, but it being turned on its head in a lot of different contexts. So I can appreciate as those things happen in 2025 and we see the loss of the hard work that was done a generation ago, people wanting to preserve those things instead of fighting for the freedom that we should be fighting for.
Yeah. So if I understand correctly, it's because one thing I want to talk with you about is how do we move forward? What did we do right or wrong? And before I get to that question, one of the things I was thinking as you were saying is you have an appreciation for it, not in a sense that you believe having made some concessions and not gone far enough and not been more progressive on some issues in order to have maybe the middle of the road or smaller wins was a strategy. You have appreciation for it because you understand it better, but it's almost like something to learn from so that when we build, we can do better, kind of learn from the fact that we made these concessions and look at where we are.
That's exactly right. We made these concessions and we also adopted strategies that sounded popular or sounded good, even though they were in a lot of ways counterintuitive. There certainly were people who knew and understood and were calling out for less punitive measures at that time. And the dampening of those voices is something that we should be really careful to not repeat as well.
Yeah. So how do we not do this again like this? I've been asking people on this podcast because we talk about a lot of issues that are under attack right now. What do we do wrong? What do we do now? And how do we move forward? And it's not because I believe this is our fault, right? I don't think we're fully responsible for the craziness that we see. I mean it more in the sense of like, how do we make sure that moving forward, the strides that we make can't be rolled back so easily? Are we doomed to repeat the cycle?
One thing I'm learning more and more is that we never really win the narrative battle. It's something we have to fight persistently. And if we are not constantly reminding ourselves and each other about the underlying bases for these law changes, they will all disappear. And I think about my lifespan, the gains that have been won, just like my parents' lifespan, the civil rights gains that were won. And the starkest example for me is the gay marriage changes that happened, what felt like very rapidly, but were really following a huge narrative and culture shift. And it leaves me worried that those gains are also as vulnerable. They're not continuing that same narrative and culture shift. We will find ourselves in the position that our parents now find themselves saying, oh, wow, remember when we had gay marriage rights in this country and how hard fought that was and how it just disappeared because we didn't protect the conversation and what was driving the underlying belief system that really decides what our laws are going to be and how they endure.
So even after you have the policy wins, when you have the policy wins, you can't just say it's a victory and let's move on. You have to continue talking about it, teaching about it, doing research about it.
Absolutely.
All the things that are trying to be like rolled back and pushed back and defunded right now.
Yes, because
But
there's an appreciation for how much that history matters. And folks who want to see those wins disappear understand that if people learn and share and appreciate the history that brought us here, they will be less likely to go along with the terrible ideas that are being pushed.
Yeah. I mean, I completely agree with you. And that's one reason I am doing this podcast, is because I think along with the research and the academia and the organizing and the, being politically active, you have to keep talking about this stuff. And I think especially in moments like this, people are afraid to do so, right? And what happens then is people who are rebel rousers or who find themselves emboldened to say some of the crazy things that we've all heard, in public discourse, they become the dominant voice. And unless we're also willing to keep talking about it and keep it, bringing it back down to earth,
yes,
and having these sane conversations, that's going to be who's going to have the stage and the spotlight and the microphone, unless we also create our own microphones and our own stages, right? And so but I want to pause for a second, and I want to get your reaction to a clip that I'm sure you have seen before. And then I want to talk a little bit more about this criminal justice work that Patrice and I watch a video of President Bill Clinton signing the 1994 crime bill, using fear-mongering language about crime and public safety, and emphasizing a need to get tough on crime. This was a bill that has largely contributed to the problem of mass incarceration in the U.S. You can find a link to the video in the description of this podcast. Let's stop there. You get the picture.
I do.
What is your reaction to this?
In trying to be generous in my reaction to that clip, I will say,
you don't have to be.
I think about a lot of the things that people didn't know and understand then, what empirical data didn't exist, and maybe an underappreciation for how mass incarceration could actually drive violent crime up. But there were things that we did know. We did know that there wasn't a distinction along those lines between people who caused harm and people who were victims of harm. We knew that those were largely the same populations and not divided the way that division was sown through a lot of the messaging there. And what also strikes me are several examples of just pure hypocrisy. The failure or refusal to acknowledge who caused the violence and drug activity and other kinds of crime they described happening in our neighborhoods, in our schools. There certainly was an understanding, even if not a public acknowledgement, from people in positions of leadership for the government's role in not just depriving people of what they need to live well, but also affirmatively causing more crime in our communities. And the other sort of example of hypocrisy that really stands out to me in that clip is that we've seen so many examples of people who are getting away with all kinds of heinous acts that are not punished at the same level, who are not only able to really benefit from capitalism, but benefit politically day in and day out. And that includes anything from mass wage theft to polluting communities in a way that is technically homicide under almost every definition of murder in the 50 states, to participating actively in sexual assaults and sex trafficking rings at the highest levels of government, to finding drugs inside the White House not too long ago, if we think about that. And so really the double standard stands out to me a lot as I watch it again, because I try to think about how much we can learn better and do better, but there's a lot that was already learned and understood and hidden to move an agenda forward that would benefit certain people and harm others.
To me, it's a couple of things stand out, a lot more than a couple of things, but I'll mention a couple of things right now. One, if you take these types of speeches and these talking points out of context, who can disagree? Everybody should have public safety. Everybody should follow our society's laws. People should be safe from harm. If you overstep the bounds, there has to be some consequences. But what happens is folks, ordinary folks who have not had to, and I really encourage everybody, whoever I talk to, whether it's in this platform, just do your own digging. We just don't have the luxury to just listen and make up our mind like that. But when you take it out of context, yeah, it sounds great. But when you put it within a society that is so unequal, where people do not have access to the same basic human rights and things that you need to be able to thrive and be a productive member of society, and then you impose these laws that are equal on their face to this very unequal society, what you do is then perpetuate more inequality. And I think people don't understand that. And the other thing, what you said is like mass incarceration actually increases crime. And I think for people, that's hard to wrap their head around. But being in prison for long terms where you don't have any of your needs met doesn't help you to come out and be like, I'm going to do things differently now. No matter how much you might want to, you just don't have those opportunities, whether on the outside or the inside. So all of that aside, I think there's a difference between the law on the books and the law in action, which is, I think, a nuance, a very important distinction that a lot of people don't fully recognize or think about. The other thing it makes me think about is you and I have both heard that there's potentially another crime. This was the biggest crime bill America's ever had. And it was one of the main drivers of America becoming the largest incarcerator in the world, where I always say, if what we were doing worked, we should be the safest country in the world. We have more people in prison and jail than any place else per capita. And we just got to pay attention to that. But it's also not a right or left issue all the time. I think particularly the issue of public safety and crime is something that is used as a political, I don't know if the right word is bargaining chip, but a political tool on both sides. So Clinton signed the worst crime bill we've ever seen into law. And now what we're hearing is Donald Trump is getting ready to potentially introduce a new crime bill as well, which none of us know exactly what's going to be in it, but I think he mentioned it in a speech he gave in March. And so I think we can expect more of the same. And these things always have a tendency to happen as we get closer to the election and folks are worried about losing power. But it's almost like the right hand starts something and the left hand finishes it, or the left hand starts something and the right hand finishes it. And we're so caught up trying to figure out which hand is doing what that we lose kind of the understanding and the attention that is required to what is actually happening. Who cares if Republicans are doing it or Democrats are doing it, right? This is not like a team sport. Right. It's being treated as such, but I think we have to stop looking at the world in such like black and white terms.
I think that's right. And I think there's hopefully a middle ground between the level of nuance that you and I enjoy and like digging into and supporting, and that false dichotomy that we see all the time. I've watched so many conversations where really one person is talking about social responsibility and another person's talking about individual personal responsibility, as if we don't need to talk about both.
Yep.
or I see folks really zoom into one, not even just individual person or individual case, but individual harm and try to extrapolate to an entire system instead of doing the opposite and saying, what's the impact of this system? Right. And to your point earlier about how when you take one individual out of the community and cause that kind of trauma and have them come home, they might not be better off than before they came in. The same is true when we look at the entire neighborhood block or community, when we're taking people out in mass. Even setting aside the fact that they're then being traumatized and put back, that actually doesn't make our neighborhoods safer. The loss alone, whether it was mass incarceration or mass deportation or death and violence happening in higher concentrations in those communities than in other places, we should be concerned about the instability that causes as a whole system, and we should be applying that rationale and that reasoning to the individual harms and cases instead of the other way around. So I think there are ways to make the conversations only slightly more complicated, but still very much the way we normally reason, the way we normally talk about every other issue in our lives.
Yeah. And we could have a whole other episode about what that does to the children and the families of people who are impacted, what that does to their even like economic earning potential.
Yes.
Whether that there's a whole like host of collateral consequences to these single incidents that we see online, someone being deported, someone being kidnapped, someone being brutalized, someone being shot to death, someone being wrongfully imprisoned, a whole host of collateral consequences that follows people generationally that I think people don't take into account. So, I think I would love for everybody to just have a place in their heart to bring all of these conversations about stuff that's really serious and impacts us, that we all care about, to like a human level. And I hope to inject that into society through this platform and whatever else I do. But I think we got to get back at get that back into the mix.
I'm glad you said that, because we often hear about things that are labeled as extremely punitive as being very common sense. Well, this terrible thing happened, and so putting someone in a cage is this is a common sense measure. Of course, we don't want people to engage in this. But there really is nothing common sense about removing people from their families and communities and then doing nothing for those children. It should shock us that someone could be sent away to prison for years on end, and there is nothing that triggers to make sure that child who was impacted by that loss, just as if a family member were deported or deployed or died, nothing happens to make sure that they're okay automatically. And we hope for the best and find ourselves puzzled when the worst happens in each of those scenarios. And we call that common sense. It's just really a good illustration of the fiction that we're living in.
Very skewed, very skewed. Yeah, 100%. Let me ask you now about your new role.
Thanks.
At NYU Law. Tell us about the center, its history and its mission, and your vision for it.
I'm very proud to be at the center. It started in 2017 and launched with a conversation between Tony Thompson from NYU, Brian Stevenson, Sherilyn Eiffel, and Loretta Lynch. And if you were to watch back or read back that conversation, you would think it was happening today. It is so prescient, and they talk about us being on this perilous path that we have seen ourselves walk down since then and start to speed down this year. And it feels refreshing to be able to talk about the truth of the impact of racial animus and disparate impact on our lives and laws, and to be able to remind people of the importance of reexamining the harms that are caused by, intentionally and unintentionally, the laws as we've written them, and our power under our existing and potential legal frameworks to really push ourselves to a more equal society. We are working across a number of areas, including criminal legal system reform, but also social and economic justice and technology and race, environmental justice, and that narrative and culture work that we talked about earlier.
So those are the priorities of the center. And it's called the Center on Race, Inequality, and the Law. And is it mostly research-based, or do you take on cases as well? Is it advocacy-based? Do you work with community? What does the work look like in public? And what is the strategy or the theory of change behind it?
It includes a number of strategies, from litigation to legislation and policy change to really trying to change the landscape in which our laws are made. I think a lot about Lani Guinier's work, where she describes jurisprudence, legisprudence, and demisprudence, and the power of community to change and impact the way our laws are shaped and the way our lawmakers understand
You
law
may
and
have to
society.
walk us through those three things.
Sure. So when we think about our courts and jurisprudence, we might think about strategies like impact litigation or even the individual representation of people in court. And sometimes that's a single case. Sometimes it's Brown versus Board of Education, which was 20 years to 100 years in the making, depending on how you want to measure it. I remember when I was a trial lawyer saying to myself, oh, things move so slowly through the courts. I need to change the actual laws. And just as soon as I said that to myself and moved into policy work, we saw a court move things very quickly, just in the wrong direction. And it became very clear that you can do a lot through litigation alone, depending on who the decision makers are and how seriously they take their role and what level of bias we allow our courts to tolerate. On the policymaking side, which is where I really light up and something I enjoy doing, we think about how we change not just the laws and the statutes on the books, but also the rules that govern how our courts operate, the regulations that are in place, and the sort of practical things that lawyers think about in regulating our own profession, I think are territories that folks don't necessarily always think about, but are really important targets when we're trying to reshape our legal system. And demisprudence is that understanding of how communities can shape the impact of a law on society and also society's impact on the law. And really that landscape shift for how lawmakers understand the world in which they're making the law and how the public comes to tolerate or not tolerate, in our case, racism, because that's really our focus. And so that includes all of the narrative shift and culture change work we talked about earlier, but it also includes like the framework for movement lawyering and what it means to have community as client and find those best interest, express interests that we need to move forward, whether it's through the courts, through our lawmakers, or through another strategy entirely.
I love that. I'm so excited that you have this new role, and I know you're going to continue to kick butt and you're going to make a lot of great change. And I can't wait to watch and support you. Continue to do this work. I'm going to turn to a couple of questions I ask everybody.
Okay.
Number one on that list is, what are the values and the moments that shaped who you are even before you found yourself at the forefront of this work, that made you choose this path and go down this route in your career and your life?
The values that I think shaped me more than anything else are a commitment to truth-telling, which I guess some people would characterize as honesty or integrity, but to me it means something more affirmative than that. I was named after Patrice Lumumba, and I'm just acutely aware of how powerful it is to tell history in a way that's accurate and what it means for people in a position of power to decide what's going to be the truth a decade later or now 6 decades later. And I have a very low threshold for people in positions of power getting away with saying things that are not true. And that really, I think, shines through the way I approach my work as well. And in terms of moments that really shaped where I wanted to put my energy as a professional, I am part of a family that has a Black newspaper, a weekly newspaper in Jackson, Mississippi. And the reason the newspaper has played so profoundly in the story of my life is also because of that power of truth telling. But I was in high school when the Jackson Advocate was firebombed. And I remember thinking, this is something I thought happened only in history books that was still happening much later. And it was a helpful reminder of how dangerous it is to think about discrimination as something nonviolent when it's happening in certain contexts, and divorcing that from its really violent roots. And I've just always understood those things to be inextricably linked, and thought it important to not tolerate any kind of animus, however it shows up.
Wow. Quite a story and a legacy that your parents have left and you're leaving. But it's interesting that you say when you saw that happen, one of your first thoughts was like, I thought this only happened in history books. And I bet you a lot of young people now, perhaps most people in the Black community and some people in the brown community aren't having as a shocked reaction, because this has been to an extent the reality for them. But many young people at large are seeing what's happening now with the raids and the kidnappings and the suspension of due process and things like that. And they're saying, I thought this is something that happened in history books,
Yes.
you know?
Or in other parts of the world that don't have the protections we're told we have. And I think what folks might start to appreciate more and more in the coming months is that our rights are only as strong as our remedies.
Yep.
And those, just as there are all these attacks on narrative and history, there are a lot of attacks happening on remedies that I hope people pay attention to as well, because our civil rights statutes won't mean anything if there's no way to redress the violations.
The harm that's been done and that continues to have severe negative consequences for people that were harmed. So the second question, what's a conversation you'd like to reset? It could be anything. It could be about what we've talked about. It could be serious. It doesn't have to be.
I'd like to reset the conversation around what progress looks like. I think we're in at least the 8th or 9th year of folks that I knew who spent a lot of their life fighting for something better, holding on for dear life and white knuckling it and trying to ride through a moment of great challenge. And I worry that we're going to lose sight of those things we wanted to build and those things we wanted to make better. And I think we should always be really mindful that progress means moving forward and not just holding the line. And I think we should be insistent on what we know to be the right thing and not just the less awful thing.
I totally agree with you. That's a good one. We'll help you reset it.
Thanks.
Before we wrap, is there anything that we didn't talk about that you really want to mention, or anything that you want folks to know about this work or this issue, especially in this moment?
I want people to really follow along with the experts who are paying attention to what's happening to our laws and those things that might not be getting as much attention as other grabbier headlines. We need to know that there are executive orders that say we can't talk about race as a social construct in certain contexts. We need to know that the EEOC is not taking cases based on disparate impact anymore. A lot of the things that don't appear in our daily lives or popular culture are going to have enormous consequences for how we live together. And I hope that folks will open up to really following these civil rights leaders that I've learned so much from and legal scholars I've learned so much from, so that we don't lose sight of those bigger battles too.
Yeah, amen. It's not a time to disengage. We just don't have that luxury anymore.
Agree.
Thank you so much. This has been a very informative and, just for me, because I care so much about this issue, enjoyable conversation to have had this time to sit down with you and really dig deep into it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and go forth and make all the changes.
Thank you.
That's it for today. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you take this conversation back into your world and reset something. Please follow us on social media platforms and subscribe to Reset Critical wherever you listen to your podcasts. Till next time, stay hopeful. Thanks for tuning in to Reset Critical. Remember, the opinions you heard today belong to our guests and don't necessarily reflect the views of the institutions they represent, the host, producers, or our sponsors and affiliates. Mentions of products or organizations aren't endorsements. We're here to spark ideas and dialogue. Until next time, take care and keep thinking critically.